Welcome to Horror Camp. I know these videos are meant to help you drift off to sleep, but before you do, hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss another chilling tale. Today, Matthew has a story for you, a tale of greed, betrayal, and a haunting reminder that some secrets are better left buried. This is the story of Mr. Harrington, his desperate, greedy hunt, and the terrifying price he paid for his ambition. So get cozy, and let's begin. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time at my dad's office. He worked the night shift at a company that specialized in manufacturing and logistics, though to me it always felt more like the setting of a ghost story. The building was old, cracky floors, narrow hallways, and dim fluorescent lights that cast unsettling shadows everywhere you looked. I never paid much attention to the details back then. I was just a kid, excited to spend time with my dad. But there was one person I couldn't ignore, Mr. Harrington. He was one of my dad's colleagues, a sharp-dressed man who seemed to thrive on making others miserable. Harrington was the kind of person who smiled in front of the boss but sneered at everyone else. He was ambitious to a fault, willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate to climb the corporate ladder. My dad always said, people like Harrington get what's coming to them eventually. I didn't know how true that was until one fateful night. A night when greed pushed Harrington too far, and something far darker came to collect. I usually visit my dad at work. He worked the night shift at a local company. For me, those visits were an adventure. I loved the quiet hum of machines, the glow of computer screens in dimly lit rooms, and most of all, the chance to spend time with my dad. But for others, like Mr. Harrington, it was a battleground, a place where ambition turned toxic and people fought to climb a ladder that didn't care who it crushed on the way up. My dad was a kind-hearted, diligent worker, the kind of person everyone liked. He treated his co-workers like family, offering help when they struggled and sharing laughs during breaks. He was the glue that held the night shift together. And then there was Mr. Harrington, his polar opposite. Harrington was sharp-tongued, manipulative, and always seemed to have an agenda. Where my dad saw teamwork, Harrington saw competition. He thrived on finding others' weaknesses and using them to his advantage. At the time, I didn't fully understand the tension between them, but I could feel it. Harrington always seemed to linger around my dad's desk, watching, waiting, like a predator circling its prey. I remember asking my dad once, "Why is Mr. Harrington always so angry?" My dad just smiled and said, "Some people are never happy, son. They think the only way to win is to make everyone else lose." Little did I know, Harrington's greed and selfishness would lead to something far worse than an angry work environment. My dad was everything Harrington wasn't. He was the kind of person who would go out of his way to help someone, even if it meant staying late or taking on extra work. The other employees admired him, not just for his work ethic but for his character. He believed in doing the right thing even when no one was watching. My dad often said, "At the end of the day, it's not about the job you do, but how you treat the people around you." Harrington, on the other hand, lived by a different mantra: win at any cost. He was always impeccably dressed, his suit tailored, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, but beneath the surface he was as cutthroat as they came. He had a way of making you feel small, like every word out of your mouth was a waste of his time. Rumors swirled about how he took credit for projects he didn't work on, sabotaged co-workers who outshined him, and manipulated the boss to keep himself in favor. Mr. Jeff was their boss. He was a strict but fair man, or at least that's how he seemed. He valued results above all else, which meant he rarely looked too closely at how those results were achieved. As long as the work got done, he turned a blind eye to office politics. Harrington knew this and used it to his advantage, positioning himself as the star employee while undermining anyone who threatened his spotlight. The rest of the team was a mix of personalities. There was Linda, the receptionist, who always greeted everyone with a warm smile, even when Harrington barked orders at her. Carl, the janitor, kept to himself, but seemed to know everything that went on in the building. And then there was Sarah, a junior employee who often confided in my dad about how uncomfortable Harrington made her feel. Together, they painted a picture of a workplace that was functional on the surface, but deeply fractured underneath. The basement was the most unsettling part. It was rarely used except for storing old files and broken equipment. The air was damp and heavy, and the walls were lined with shelves full of dusty boxes and forgotten items. The locked storage room at the end of the basement hall was particularly intriguing. No one ever went near it, and the key was kept in the boss's office. There were stories, wild ones, about what might be inside, but no one knew for sure. Every workplace has its share of gossip, but in my dad's office, the rumors felt different. Darker, more sinister. People whispered about Mr. Carlton, a senior employee who had vanished years ago under mysterious circumstances. He was said to have been brilliant but outspoken, the kind of person who made enemies in high places. Some believed he had uncovered something about the company, something dangerous, and paid the price for it. The locked storage room in the basement was at the center of many of these rumors. Some said it held documents that could destroy the company. Others claimed it was cursed, that anyone who opened it would regret it. Harrington, of course, dismissed these stories as nonsense. He thrived on facts and figures, not ghost stories. But as you'll soon see, the truth has a way of catching up to people, especially those who think they're untouchable. Harrington's hunger for power had always been apparent, but it reached a fever pitch when rumors of a company reorganization began circulating. For years he had built his career by climbing over others, stealing credit, spreading lies, and manipulating those around him. Now, with the promise of a high-ranking position on the horizon, his greed evolved into something far darker, more dangerous. At first, Harrington's tactics were subtle. He began planting seeds of doubt about your dad's capabilities in the boss's mind. He'd casually remark, "I think Frank's been struggling with deadlines lately. Maybe the night shift's too much for him." Over time, these seemingly innocent observations grew into outright sabotage. One night, my dad stayed late to finalize an important project, a proposal that could secure the company a lucrative contract. Harrington waited until my dad stepped away for a break, then crept over to his desk. With a practiced hand, he shuffled papers, deleted files, and even swapped key figures in the proposal to ensure it would fail. When the project was submitted, the errors were glaring, and my dad was called into the boss's office for a humiliating lecture. My dad was a professional. He didn't accuse Harrington outright, but the tension between them was palpable. When he came home that night, he seemed unusually quiet. You remember asking if everything was okay, and he simply said, "Some people will do anything to get ahead." The rumors about the reorganization became official during a staff meeting one evening. The boss, standing at the head of the conference table, explained that the company would be restructuring its leadership. A new position, one that came with significant authority and influence, would be opening up. The boss didn't say it outright, but it was clear this was the kind of role Harrington had been dreaming of. Harrington's eyes practically gleamed with excitement. He could already see himself in the position, wielding power over the entire office. But there was one problem: competition. Several employees, including your dad, were qualified for the role, and Harrington knew he needed an edge to ensure he came out on top. One night, As Harrington lingered outside the boss's office, he overheard a conversation that would change everything. The boss, speaking to a senior manager, mentioned an old briefcase belonging to Mr. Carlton, the employee who had vanished years ago. Carlton was working on something big before he disappeared, the boss said. The documents in that briefcase could be critical to the reorganization. It's locked up in the basement storage room, though, and I haven't had the time to go through it. I'll need to take a look soon. Harrington's ears perked up. The briefcase sounded like it contained exactly what he needed. A way to secure the promotion and eliminate his rivals. Whatever was inside had been deemed important enough to lock away for years, and Harrington was certain it held the key to his future. From that moment, the briefcase consumed Harrington's thoughts. He began probing co-workers for information, asking casual but calculated questions about Mr. Carlton and the storage room. Most people brushed him off, unwilling to dig into the company's darker history. The janitor Carl was the only one who gave Harrington a lead. "You don't want to mess with that room," Carl warned one evening. "People say it's cursed. Carlton was always down there poking around, and look what happened to him. He just vanished." Harrington scoffed at the idea. Cursed or not, he was determined to get into that room and retrieve the briefcase. After all, he didn't believe in ghosts or curses. To him, the only thing that mattered was getting ahead, and if that briefcase held even a shred of information that could help him, he was going to claim it. Harrington's discovery of the briefcase's existence was like striking gold, or so he thought. The idea that it might contain documents tying Mr. Carlton's unfinished work to the upcoming reorganization became an obsession. It wasn't just about the promotion anymore. It was about power, control, and being one step ahead of everyone else. At first, Harrington tried to rationalize his fixation. "It's just a briefcase," he told himself. "But what if it's the key to everything? What if Carlton's work could guarantee my spot at the top?" These thoughts gnawed at him, day and night. In meetings, his mind wandered, imagining what secrets might lie inside the locked storage room. Even at home, he couldn't escape it. The briefcase became an almost mythical object in his mind, representing the future he believed he deserved. Harrington knew he couldn't access the storage room without help. The boss held the only official key, and there was no way Harrington could ask for it without raising suspicion. That left one option: Carl, the janitor. Carl was known for keeping to himself, quietly going about his duties without getting involved in the office drama. But Harrington had a way of manipulating people, finding their weaknesses and exploiting them. He cornered Carl one evening as the office emptied out, flashing his practiced smile. "Carl," he began smoothly, "I hear you've got access to the storage room downstairs." Carl barely looked up from his mop. "Yeah, so? No one's allowed in there." Harrington leaned in, lowering his voice. "Look, I need to take a quick peek at some old files. Nothing major. I'll be in and out before you know it." Carl hesitated, glancing nervously at the floor. "That room's been locked for years. Even the boss barely goes down there. You shouldn't mess with it." But Harrington was relentless. He pulled out an envelope and held it out to Carl. "Let's just say there's something in it for you. Enough to make it worth your while." Carl eyed the envelope warily. "This ain't about the money, Harrington. People say that room's bad luck. Carlton spent a lot of time there before he... well, you know." Harrington rolled his eyes. "Bad luck? Don't tell me you believe in that superstitious nonsense. Carlton was a fool who got in over his head. I'm not him. Now, are you going to help me or not?" Carl sighed, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "Fine. But don't say I didn't warn you." He handed over the key, his expression grim. "Whatever you're looking for, I hope it's worth it." Word of Harrington's sudden interest in the storage room began to spread. Linda, the receptionist, confronted him during a coffee break. "Harrington, what are you up to? You've been asking a lot of questions about Carlton lately." Harrington smirked, brushing her off. "Just curious about company history. Is that a crime?" Linda wasn't convinced. "People say that room is cursed. Carlton spent hours down there digging through files, obsessing over something. Then he disappeared. Maybe you should let it go." Sarah, the junior employee, chimed in. "Yeah, Harrington, some things are better left alone. Besides, do you really think whatever's in that room is worth risking your career over?" Harrington's smile faded, replaced by a cold glare. "You two need to stop listening to fairy tales. Carlton was incompetent, and that's why he's not here anymore. I'm nothing like him. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." Despite the warnings, Harrington couldn't shake his obsession. To him, the briefcase represented opportunity, a chance to outsmart everyone else and cement his place at the top. He convinced himself that his co-workers were just jealous or too scared to take risks. In his mind, the risks were irrelevant. The higher the stakes, the bigger the reward, he thought. Let them believe in curses and ghosts. I'm the only one willing to do what it takes to win. With the key now in his possession, Harrington felt unstoppable. That night, he stayed late, waiting until the office was empty. As the clock ticked toward midnight, he made his way to the basement, the key clutched tightly in his hand. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint hum of the building's machinery seemed to fade into silence. When he reached the storage room door, he paused, his breath visible in the chilly air. For a brief moment, doubt crept into his mind, but he quickly dismissed it, his greed overpowering any sense of caution. "Whatever's in there," he muttered to himself, "it's mine now." The storage room door creaked open, revealing a space untouched by time. Dust hung in the air like a fine mist, and the smell of mildew and aged paper assaulted Harrington's senses. Rows of forgotten filing cabinets and shelves lined the walls, their contents left to rot in obscurity. At the far end of the room, illuminated by a dim, flickering bulb, sat the object of his obsession. The briefcase. It was an unassuming black leather case, its surface worn and scuffed. With a tarnished brass clasp, it rested atop a lone table, as though waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to claim it. Harrington felt a rush of adrenaline as he stepped closer, his shoes crunching on the gritty floor. "So this is it," he muttered, running his fingers over the cool leather. He hesitated for a moment, the eerie silence of the room pressing down on him, but greed overpowered his unease. With a swift motion, he flipped open the clasp and lifted the lid. Inside, he found what looked like an ordinary stack of papers, blueprints, financial records, and handwritten notes. But what caught his attention was a single folded piece of yellowed paper lying on top. He unfolded it, revealing a cryptic message scrawled in spidery handwriting. "The price of greed is eternal." Harrington frowned, shaking his head. "What is this nonsense?" he muttered, crumpling the note and shoving it into his pocket. He dismissed it as the ramblings of a paranoid mind. Probably Mr. Carlton's. He gathered the papers, stuffed them back into the briefcase, and snapped shut. As he turned to leave, the lights flickered violently, plunging the room into darkness for a few heart-stopping seconds. The air grew colder, and a faint whisper seemed to echo from the shadows. Harrington froze, his breath hitching. For a brief moment, He thought he saw movement in the corner of his eye, a dark figure shifting in the shadows. He shook his head, forcing a laugh to break the tension. "Get it together, Harrington. It's just an old building." Clutching the briefcase tightly, he hurried out of the room, locking the door behind him. The whispers followed him down the hall, fading only when he reached the elevator. As the doors slid shut, he exhaled deeply, trying to shake off the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. Harrington's drive home was uneventful, but the briefcase felt heavy on the passenger seat, almost as though it carried more than just papers. The cryptic note lingered in his mind, but he dismissed it as a meaningless scare tactic. When he got home, he placed the briefcase on his desk and opened it again. The documents inside were even more intriguing than he'd hoped. Old memos outlining high-level plans, confidential contracts, and Carlton's detailed research on company operations. Harrington's lips curled into a satisfied grin. "This is it," he thought. "This is what's going to make me untouchable." The note, now crumpled in his pocket, was quickly forgotten, but as he worked through the night, strange things began to happen. The room seemed colder than usual, and no matter how many layers he put on, he couldn't shake the chill. Shadows flickered in the corners of his vision, but when he turned, there was nothing there. The briefcase creaked open on its own once, its lid slowly rising as though inviting him to look deeper. By the time the clock struck midnight, Harrington was on edge. His once confident demeanor had given way to irritation, then unease. He tried to focus on the documents, but the words seemed to blur and shift on the pages. Then came the whisper. Faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but unmistakable. "Reed takes all." Harrington jolted upright, his eyes darting around the room. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to breathe. "It's just your imagination," he muttered. "You're tired, that's all." But the whisper came again, louder this time, and accompanied by a faint scraping sound, like fingernails dragging across wood. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker, thicker, as though they were alive. Unbeknownst to Harrington, the act of taking the briefcase had awakened something bound to it, a vengeful spirit tied to the greed and betrayal that had surrounded its original owner, Mr. Carlton. The spirit had lain dormant for years, waiting for someone foolish enough to disturb it. Harrington, blinded by ambition, had done exactly that. The night ended with Harrington slamming the briefcase shut and shoving it into a drawer, determined to deal with it in the morning. But as he lay in bed, the whispers followed him into his dreams, turning them into restless, nightmarish visions of shadowy figures and cold, skeletal hands reaching for him. Little did he know, this was just the beginning. That night, as Harrington lay in bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards. He told himself it was just the old pipes settling or the wind outside, but the unease lingered. The briefcase sat in his home office, locked and tucked away in a drawer. He'd spent hours poring over its contents, thrilled by the secrets it held. Yet now, in the stillness of the night, he couldn't stop thinking about the cryptic note. "The price of greed is eternal." He scoffed at the memory. "Just nonsense," he muttered under his breath, pulling the blanket up to his chin. But as he drifted off to sleep, the silence was broken by an unfamiliar sound. A faint whisper, distant and indistinct. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder with every passing second, until it seemed to fill the room. Harrington. His eyes snapped open, his pulse racing. He sat up, straining to hear, but the sound was gone. "It's just your imagination," he told himself. "You're tired, that's all." But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. Unable to ignore his growing unease, Harrington got out of bed and made his way to the office. The hallway felt unusually cold, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist as he passed. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus. When he reached the office, he hesitated at the door. The whispering sound was louder now, unmistakable, and it was coming from inside. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the room. The briefcase sat on his desk, its brass clasp glinting faintly in the moonlight streaming through the window. The whispers seemed to emanate from it, a faint, otherworldly murmur that made his skin crawl. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, marching over to the desk. He unlocked the drawer, pulled out the briefcase, and set it down. The whispers stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then, with a sudden, violent motion, the briefcase burst open. The papers inside flew into the air, swirling around the room like a cyclone. Harrington stumbled back, his heart pounding. The papers hovered for a moment before slamming down onto the desk, rearranging themselves into a chilling message. "Return what you took." Harrington stared at the words, his mind racing. He grabbed the papers and shoved them back into the briefcase, slamming it shut. His hands trembled as he locked it and shoved it back into the drawer. "This is impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "It's just a coincidence. It has to be." But no amount of rationalization could explain what had just happened. Exhausted and shaken, Harrington returned to bed, determined to put the incident out of his mind. But sleep brought no relief. His dreams were vivid and unsettling. He found himself back in the storage room, standing before the briefcase. The air was thick and cold, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse with life. As he reached for the briefcase, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall and thin, its body cloaked in shadows. Its face, or what was left of it, was hollow, with deep empty sockets where its eyes should have been. The figure stared at him, its head tilting slightly as if studying him. Harrington tried to move, to run, but his body refused to obey. The figure stepped closer, its skeletal hands reaching out toward him. "You took what wasn't yours," it whispered, its voice a low, guttural rasp. Harrington woke with a start, drenched in sweat. His chest heaved as he gasped for air. The image of the shadowy figure burned into his mind. The room was dark, but the briefcase's presence seemed to loom over him, even from another room. For the first time, Harrington felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Fear. The next few nights, the unsettling events only grew worse. The whispers became more frequent, sometimes following him to other parts of the house. The briefcase seemed to move on its own, shifting positions on his desk as though it had a will of its own. Doors slammed shut without warning, and the shadows in his home grew darker, deeper, as though they were watching him. Harrington tried to ignore it all, throwing himself into his work, but the documents from the briefcase seemed to taunt him, their contents blurring and shifting whenever he tried to focus. The figure from his dreams began appearing in his waking hours, always at the edge of his vision, a fleeting shadow that disappeared the moment he turned to look. It felt as though it was waiting, biding its time. Harrington's once unshakable confidence was unraveling, replaced by paranoia and dread. But he refused to return the briefcase. His greed, his pride, wouldn't allow it. "This isn't real," he told himself over and over. "It's just stress. It'll pass." Harrington had always prided himself on his ability to control any situation. But now, he was unraveling. The events of the past days, the whispers, the moving shadows, and his haunting encounter with Carlton's spirit had shaken him to his core. Instead of returning the briefcase, Harrington decided to destroy it. He convinced himself that if the briefcase was gone, the torment would end, and he could salvage what remained of his career. So, on a cold and moonless night, Harrington returned to the office with a plan. The briefcase, tucked under his arm, felt heavier than ever, as though it resisted his touch. He muttered to himself, trying to keep his fear at bay. "It's just a stupid piece of leather. Burn it, shred the papers, and this nightmare is over." The office was empty when he arrived. The usual hum of computers and machinery was absent, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. As he walked through the dimly lit hallways, his footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though the building itself was alive and watching him. Harrington made his way to the basement furnace, where he planned to destroy the briefcase and its contents. The basement, colder and darker than he remembered, seemed to stretch endlessly in the dim light. His breath fogged the air as he approached the furnace room. Just as he placed his hand on the door handle, the building's lights flickered violently, casting the hallway into alternating bursts of brightness and shadow. Then, without warning, the power went out completely, plunging Harrington into pitch. The silence was deafening, broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He fumbled for his phone, the small beam of its flashlight cutting weakly through the darkness. The briefcase felt heavier still, almost pulling him down with its weight. As the clock struck midnight, the silence shifted. A low, guttural hum began to echo through the building, vibrating through the walls and floor. Harrington's heart pounded as the sound grew louder, transforming into faint whispers that seemed to come from every direction. "Return what you took." The whispers intensified, overlapping and echoing in a cacophony of voices. Harrington clutched the briefcase tightly, his knuckles white. "Stop it!" he shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "It's not real!" But the building seemed to disagree. The temperature plummeted further, and the air became thick and suffocating. Footsteps echoed down the hallway, slow and deliberate, though no one was there. He balled backward, his phone's flashlight flickering as if the battery were draining rapidly. The beam caught a fleeting glimpse of a shadow moving at the edge of the light. "You can't escape," a voice rasped, sending chills down his spine. Suddenly, the briefcase in his hands grew unbearably hot. He dropped it with a yelp, the sound of it hitting the floor reverberating unnaturally in the confined space. The clasps sprang open, and the papers inside spilled out, swirling into the air like a swarm of angry insects. They rearranged themselves mid-air, forming a single word that hovered in glowing, blood-red letters. Panicked, Harrington kicked the briefcase away and bolted down the hallway. The whispers turned into full-throated screams, the sound of dozens, no, hundreds of voices crying out in anguish and rage. The shadows around him deepened, no longer just absence of light, but some doors slammed shut in his path, forcing him to turn back. The corridors twisted and stretched, as if the building itself had transformed into a labyrinth designed to trap him. Then he saw it, the figure from his nightmares standing at the end of the hallway. Carlton's spirit loomed larger than before, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. It raised a skeletal hand and pointed directly at Harrington. "You can't run from what you've done," the spirit intoned, its voice echoing like thunder. "You took what wasn't yours. Now, the price must be paid." Harrington's body trembled as the shadows in the storage room thickened, coiling around him like a predator closing in on its prey. The air grew colder, biting at his skin, and the faint hum of the building's machinery faded into complete silence. Then, out of the darkness, the spirit emerged. It was a skeletal figure, its form wrapped in tattered remnants of office attire. The suit, once pristine, was now shredded and stained with decay, hanging loosely over bones that seemed to glow faintly in the dark. Its hollow eyes burned with an ethereal light, and its jaw moved as though speaking, though its voice echoed directly in Harrington's mind. "You thought you could escape me, Harrington," the spirit rasped, its voice a chilling blend of anger and sorrow. "You took what wasn't yours, just as he did before you." Harrington stumbled back, his back hitting the wall. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared at the apparition, his mind racing for an explanation that wouldn't come. "Who? What are you?" he managed to stammer. The spirit stepped closer, its bony hand reaching out. In its grasp, a vision materialized, swirling like smoke. Harrington could see an image of the man it once was, Carlton, standing at a desk, surrounded by co-workers who whispered behind his back. "It was like you once," the spirit said, its tone bitter. "Ambitious, hungry, but my success made me enemies. He couldn't stand to see me rise, so he tore me down, piece by piece, just as you have done to others." The vision shifted, showing Carlton at his lowest. His projects had been sabotaged, his reputation tarnished by lies and manipulation. Harrington recognized the tactics all too well. They were his own methods, played out on someone else years before. The image changed again, this time showing my dad. He was sitting at his desk, his head in his hands after the sabotage that cost him a promotion. "Do you see the pattern, Harrington?" the spirit asked, its hollow eyes narrowing. "You think you're clever, that you're in control, but you are just another cog in the machine of greed, a machine that grinds down everyone it touches." The spirit waved its hand, and another vision appeared, this one of Sarah, the junior employee Harrington had dismissed and humiliated in a meeting. Her face was etched with despair as she packed her things, tears streaming down her cheeks. "You ruined her," the spirit hissed. "You ruined them all. And for what? A fleeting moment of power? A promotion that means nothing in the end?" The images dissolved, leaving only the spirit and Harrington in the suffocating darkness. "You think you're different," the spirit said, its voice growing louder, more forceful. "But you are no better than the one who destroyed me. Your greed has poisoned this place just as his did, and now the cycle continues." Harrington shook his head violently, tears streaming down his face. "No, I didn't mean to. I had to get ahead. It's how the world works." The spirit let out a hollow, echoing laugh. "That's what they all say. But greed takes, Harrington. It takes until there's nothing left of you. And now, it's your turn to pay." It stepped closer, and the shadows around it writhed like living things. Harrington tried to move, to flee, but his legs wouldn't obey. The spirit's skeletal hand reached out, brushing his forehead. In an instant, Harrington's mind was flooded with his own betrayals. Every lie he had told, every life he had harmed. The weight of his actions pressed down on him, suffocating him, until he collapsed to his knees. "You built your success on the suffering of others," the spirit said, its voice low and menacing. "And now, you will join me in the darkness." Harrington's panic reached its peak as the spirit loomed closer, its hollow eyes fixed on him like twin voids. His breath came in shallow gasps, his heart hammering in his chest as every instinct screamed at him to run. Desperation overpowered his fear, and with a burst of adrenaline he pushed himself to his feet and sprinted toward the door. The storage room seemed to twist around him. The door that had been mere steps away now felt impossibly distant, the shadows lengthening and writhing like living things. Harrington's hands fumbled for the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge. He yanked at it with all his strength, his nails scraping against the cold metal, but the door remained firmly shut. Behind him, the spirit's low, guttural laughter echoed through the room. "You cannot escape," it hissed, its voice reverberating through the walls. "Your greed has sealed your fate." Harrington turned, pressing his back against the door as his eyes darted around the room, searching for another way out, but the shadows had closed in, encircling him like a predator toying with its prey. The spirit stepped closer, its skeletal hands outstretched. Harrington screamed, lunging for the table where the briefcase had been moments earlier, but it was gone, swallowed by the darkness. "You took what wasn't yours," the spirit rasped, its voice echoing unnaturally. "Now you will give it back." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Harrington's legs like tendrils. He kicked and thrashed, his screams reverberating through the storage room. "Let me go, please. I'll return it. I'll fix everything," he begged, tears streaming down his face. But the spirit shook its head slowly, its hollow eyes gleaming. "There is no fixing what you've done. The price of greed must be paid." With a final chilling wail, the shadows consumed Harrington entirely, dragging him into their depths. His screams echoed through the building, rising in pitch before abruptly cutting off, leaving behind a suffocating silence. The next morning, the office was quiet as the employees trickled in, unaware of the horrors that had unfolded the night before. It wasn't until one of the junior staff ventured into the basement to retrieve some old records that the gruesome scene was discovered. Harrington's body lay on the cold, cracked floor of the storage room. His limbs were contorted at unnatural angles, his face frozen in a mask of pure terror. His eyes, wide and unseeing, seemed to stare into an abyss that no one else could perceive. Beside him, the briefcase sat closed, its leather surface pristine and unmarred, as though nothing had ever happened. The words, "the price of greed," were carved deep into the concrete floor around his body, the letters jagged and precise, as if etched by an unseen hand. The room felt colder than usual, and no one could bring themselves to step inside for long. Rumors spread quickly, whispers of curses and vengeful spirits that seemed to confirm the stories about the storage room's dark history. The boss ordered the room to be sealed, the briefcase locked away once more, but those who had seen Harrington's body could not shake the feeling that someone, was still there, watching, waiting for the next victim of greed to wander into its domain. The news of Harrington's death spread quickly through the office. Some spoke of it in hushed tones, reluctant to address the grisly details. Others openly speculated about what might have happened in that dark, silent basement. But your dad, ever the thoughtful and steady voice, remained quiet for days, processing the tragedy. One evening, as you sat with him at the dinner table, the subject finally came up. You had seen the fear in his eyes the night he came home after learning about Harrington, and you knew he had something to say. "You know," he began, his voice low and measured. "Harrington was a man who wanted so much, but didn't realize how much he was losing along the way." He stared into his coffee mug, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He was so focused on taking from others, credit, opportunities, respect, that he couldn't see what it was costing him, his reputation, his relationships, his humanity. Greed has a way of blinding people like that. You asked him if he thought Harrington had deserved what happened. He shook his head slowly. I don't think anyone deserves an end like that, he said, but I do think it's a reminder. You can only push people, and life so far before it pushes back. Harrington never learned that. He thought he could take and take and take, and that the consequences would never catch up to him. But they did, didn't they? Okay, Simon said. Right. And he sighed, leaning back in his chair. I just hope this is a reminder for all of us. Greed may seem like the quickest path to success, but it always comes at a price. And sometimes, that price is more than we're willing to. Harrington thought he had it all figured out. To him, life was a game of winners and losers, and the only way to win was to take as much as you could. He thought his ambition would make him untouchable, that his schemes and manipulations would always keep him one step ahead. But greed is a dangerous thing. It promises much but takes more than it gives. For Harrington, it wasn't just his career, it was his very soul. The briefcase didn't curse Harrington. It didn't force him to act the way he did. It was his own choices, his own greed, that led him to that basement, that made him take what wasn't his. The briefcase was just a mirror, showing him the person he had become, and in the end, he couldn't escape the reflection. Let Harrington's story be a warning. Greed is never satisfied. It feeds on you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left. And sometimes the price you pay isn't just your reputation or your career, it's everything. And so, the briefcase sits in that basement still, waiting for the next soul tempted by its secrets. Will they learn from Harrington's fate, or will the cycle continue? Only time will tell. Thank you for joining me tonight at Horror Camp. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video if you enjoyed the story. Until next time, sleep well, if you can.